In this video, we're going to be going over what we might consider post-capitalistic ideologies. So we'll explore ideologies that explain the transition from capitalism to something else, and then provide a vision of what the world might look like after capitalism. So we'll start our conversation with capitalism, though we're not going to dwell here and talk about the negatives and the critiques of capitalism. We'll get that elsewhere. But the post-capitalistic ideologies we're going to be discussing are socialism, communism, and anarchy. And we're going to discuss what each of them are and the differences between each and their relationships to one another, because I think this is often unclear when we think about all of these as one cohesive picture. We sort of lose the intricate differences between the three. So we'll be discussing all of those things. Now, in the Marxist conception of these, you can sort of think of this as the stages that societies go through after capitalism. So when capitalism falls, it falls as a result of changes in the material world. So you can think of this as going on a linear path from capitalism to socialism to communism. Though it's important to note that Marx and Engels never used communism and socialism as two distinct stages. In their theories, those terms were used interchangeably. It wasn't until after Marx's death that this as sort of three distinct stages in human evolution were added to a Marxist theory. So when we're talking about original theory from Marx and Engels, these two terms are used interchangeably. They're not two distinct different stages in human development. So then we're left thinking, what is anarchy and how does it fit into this picture of these stages? So we'll get more in a few minutes on the specifics of anarchy and how it differs from these other three. But for right now, we can think of anarchy as being the same as end-level communism. So for right now, we'll think of those as being the same. We'll talk about the differences in a second. Interestingly, and most people don't know this, but communists and anarchists want the same thing. They both have the same end vision for what humanity looks like. The biggest sort of ideological battle between communists and anarchists is the transition from capitalism to this end phase, that being socialism. So the communists, in general, we're going to use the general terms here for communists and anarchists. We won't talk about the specific different theories within each of those schools of thought right now. But the communists view socialism as a required and necessary stage in a post-capitalistic society in order to facilitate the transition into communism. Anarchists don't. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes when we start reading from some of these different theorists. So, what is communism? Let's try to answer that question first. I'm going to read some quotes here from some different sources to kind of give us an idea of our understanding of this topic. According to the OED, communism is a theory or system of social organization in which all property is owned by the community and each person contributes and receives according to their ability and needs. Okay, so this probably isn't too far off from what most people think of when they think of communism. Now, I'm going to read some quotes from The Principles of Communism, which Engels wrote in 1847, that will give us more of an idea of how they thought, Marx and Engels, about this thing. So, number one from The Principles of Communism. What is communism? Engels says, communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. Okay? He continues. This is fast forwarding now in this list to number 14. What will this new social order have to be like? So now he's giving us a little bit of specifics of what does the future look like under communism. He says, quote, above all, it will have to take control of industry and of all branches of production out of the hands of mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all these branches of production are operated by society as a whole. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan, and with the participation of all members of society. In other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. Okay, so communism for Marx and Engels, and remember they use these two terms interchangeably, so we could be discussing socialism or communism here, is in a nutshell the ownership of the means of production by the proletariat. Remember, the proletariat are the working class, the lower class in a society for Marx and Engels. So if communism for Engels and Marx is the proletariat's ownership of the means of production, what does that actually look like? What does society look like if we are communist? I gave you a small excerpt of what Engels gives us. Let's hear a little bit from Marx, but I must note that contrary to popular belief, Karl Marx doesn't actually give us a lot of what a communist world looks like. The vast majority of his writing is critiquing capitalism and economic theory, a little bit of revolution and how the transition takes place, which is what is mostly laid out in the Communist Manifesto. But you should have read the manifesto and you might be left thinking, okay, what does the world look like? The answer is he doesn't give us a lot. Marxist scholars are left trying to read between the lines and fill in the gaps to paint a picture of what a post-capitalistic society would look like, according to Karl Marx, and there's not a lot there. We're not going to try to read between the lines here and come up with some theory by filling in the gaps left by Marx, but I will read one quote that Marx gives us that gives us a little bit of an idea of what he has in mind. This is from a work written in 1875 called A Critique of the Gotha Program. Quote, "What we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it has developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. What he has given to it is his individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of the individual hours of work. The individual labor time of the individual producer is part of the social working day contributed to him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such an amount of labor, after deducting his labor for the common funds. And with this certificate he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost. The same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, he receives back in another." So essentially, communist society is getting from society what you put in it. In fact, you might have heard this, perhaps the most popular quote from Marx when he's describing communism, which is in the work that I just read, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." That's communism in a nutshell. Now we're still left thinking, how does this work in the real world? We're not going to touch on that here. We're going to leave this as at the abstract ideological level, because that is our goal. So then, what is socialism? Okay, if that's sort of the communist world, how does socialism fit into this? Like I said, this is sort of a transitional phase, right? But remember, that didn't exist for Marx and Engels. They viewed them as interchangeably. But how does the modern world view socialism today? This is again from the OED. This is their definition of socialism. "A political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole." Common ownership of the means of production, right? Just like we were talking about before. So the question then becomes, how does this happen? How do we transition from capitalism to communism? And this is what is laid out in the manifesto that you all should have read. I'm not going to go through the details of the manifesto. You should have read it. You should have an understanding of how this happens, this revolutionary force that is explained in this work. In a nutshell, the proletariat seize control of the state and implement socialist policy, and from there, as a result, established a communist society. So the proletariat, the working class, seize control of the state. That is the first step in getting to this post-capitalistic society. Now is where we get to the contradictions, the conflicts, the disagreements between anarchists and socialists. Okay, because this is the step that the anarchists disagree with. But first, let's give us a definition of anarchy. What does that mean? Because I think when most people think of anarchy, they think of chaos, people in the streets and murdering each other and stealing and robbing and no laws. That's not what we're getting at here when we're talking about anarchy as an ideology, and I'll explain more of that in a second. So this is the definition of anarchy from the OED yet again. Belief in the abolition of all government and the organization of society on a voluntary, cooperative basis without recourse to force or compulsion. Okay. Interestingly, there's an interesting ideological battle that takes place between Karl Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. These are two people that you would never want to get in an intellectual debate with, and they debate with each other, and they're debating over this very specific step, the proletariat taking control of the state. Bakunin does not agree that this is the path to their shared common vision for the future. Remember, they agree on what the end goal is, they just disagree on the path. So I'm going to read you a quote here from Bakunin that kind of lays out his problems with Marxist theory. This is from his work Statism and Anarchism, which you should also read. He says, "I detest communism because it is the negation of liberty. I cannot conceive of humanity without liberty. I am not a communist because communism concentrates and absorbs all the powers of society and the state. It necessarily ends with the concentration of property in the hands of the state. I, on the other hand, want the abolition of the state, the radical elimination of the principle of authority and tutelage of the state, under the pretext of making men moral and civilized. The state has enslaved, oppressed, exploited, and corrupted them. I want the organization of society and collective social property by free association from the bottom up, not by authority from the top down." Okay, that is clear enough, I think. I don't need commentary on that. Let's hear from two other famous anarchists about their conception of anarchy, and that will give us a little bit more about what we expect here. This is from Emma Goldman. She says, this is from Anarchism, What It Really Stands For, her writing. She says, "Anarchy is the philosophy of a new social order based on liberty, unrestricted by man-made law. The theory that all forms of government rest on violence, and are therefore wrong and harmful as well as unnecessary." Okay, now let's hear lastly from Peter Kropotkin. He writes in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1910, which is now a famous article on anarchism. This is his definition. "A principle or theory of life and conduct under which society is conceived without government, harmony in such a society being obtained not by submission to law or by obedience to any authority, but by free agreement between the various groups, territorial and professional, freely constituted for the sake of production and consumption, as also for the satisfaction of the infinite variety of needs and aspirations of a civilized being." Okay, so anarchy is a society without the state, if we can sum it up as simply as absolutely possible. So we might ask ourselves, if that's the end goal for the communists as well, why this big disagreement? This is the disagreement here. While pure communism might equal anarchy, socialism in no way equals anarchy. And you might hear this term from any anarchists. It is dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what the anarchists use to refer to socialism, and their theory is this: that if the proletariat seizes control of the state, that they will establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, that they will use that power to serve themselves. And according to the anarchists, then the cycle will just start over and over again, that the state power will always be wielded to benefit a small portion of society. So for anarchists, if they want to get to this common shared goal, they say that instead of seizing state power should be completely eliminated. And this is the big schism between anarchists and traditional communists. Anarchists are about abolition of the state, while communists are about seizing the power of the state.